It might be said that his choice had been made beforehand. A plausible pretense was afforded him by the fact of the capital having been left without any public administration. He had recourse to the Senate and immediately addressed letters of convocation to the different members of that body, who were still to be found in Paris. This measure was altogether illegal and irrevocably compromised those who became parties to it. But the chiefs of the coalition knew full well by what means a spirit of boldness may be infused into the composition of men. They had secured the future prospects of those who hastened to the cause of seduction, and they could not hesitate to afford guarantees to such as were ready to compromise themselves. They promised not to treat with Napoleon or with any member of his family, and mixing up by an odious fiction a handful of traitors with the whole French nation, they covered the walls of the capital with a document wherein, after collecting the votes of the French people, they declared that if the conditions of peace were to contain stronger guarantees, when the object in view was to chain down the ambition of Bonaparte, they must now be of a more favorable nature, since, by returning to a wise system of government, France herself will offer the pledge of future tranquility. The sovereigns accordingly proclaim that they will no longer treat with Napoleon Bonaparte, nor with any member of his family. They respect the integrity of the ancient France, such as she existed under her legitimate monarchs. They may be disposed to do more, because it is a professed principle with them, from which they have never swerved, that it is requisite for the happiness of Europe that France should be great and powerful. They will acknowledge and guarantee the constitution which the French nation may establish for itself. They accordingly invite the Senate to establish immediately a provisional government which may be enabled to meet the wants of the administration and to prepare the constitution best adapted to the French people. The intentions I have just expressed are held in common with me and all the other powers. Signed, Alexander, Paris, the 31st of March, 1814, at 3 in the afternoon. Those persons who had been most instrumental in favoring the measures of Talleyrand were far from anticipating all the evils those measures would infallibly occasion. They were persuaded that it was reserved to them to avert them. Did the Emperor of Russia, in his first interview, confide to M. de Talleyrand the secret of his mind and the project which he actually meditated? I can hardly believe it, notwithstanding M. de Pratt's assertion. I certainly possess no other data to build upon than my own conjectures, but these are not wholly destitute of weight. I will presently define them. Chapter 6. I was informed by a person who acted as secretary to M. de Talleyrand on the occasion to which I have adverted that this great disorganizer had drawn up his task in a twofold manner. He had placed on the list of those whom he intended to compose a provisional government the following persons. First, himself in the character of president. Second, Bourdonville, who had been his agent in Spain and in Russia. Third, Chaucourt, his colleague in the revolutionary career. Fourth, Dalberg, his own dependent, whom he had married to the daughter of Madame de Brignon. Fifth, Monsieur Barthélemy, the senator, a man universally esteemed. These choices assuredly afford no indication of an intention to recall the elder branch of the House of Bourbon, and they guaranteed a constant majority to M. de Talleyrand's own opinions. It was only after his conference with the Emperor of Russia that he substituted the Abbé de Montesquieu for M. Barthélemy. The bargain with Hartwell was not therefore what he had most at heart, and if the Emperor Alexander had not led him to foresee that he inclined towards the return to the House of Bourbon, it is probable the diplomatist would have paid little attention to his treaty. What proves how little he was disposed to act in behalf of legitimacy is that even after having acquired a knowledge of the real sentiments of the autocrat, he only selected the Abbé de Montesquieu from amongst all the friends of the monarchy in order to preserve a majority in the event of the Emperor of Russia's not having so far declared himself, but what there might yet remain some hope of making him adopt an idea which it had perhaps been found hazardous to develop to him, and which would have met with obstacles if the government had been composed of any more members of Monsieur de Montesquieu's sentiments. The government, being once framed, the next object of attention was to fill up the principal places of the administration. The Abbé Louis, a councillor of state, was chosen for the finance department. Monsieur Bugnon, a councillor of state for the interior. Monsieur Malouet, a councillor of state under banishment for the marine department. General Dupont for the war department. Monsieur Anglais, a master of requests in charge of the 3rd District of Police for the administration of general police. General Dessau for the command of the National Guard. The Archbishop of Mechlin for the Legion of Honor. And Monsieur de Bourrienne for the administration of the post. These preliminary labors being completed, Monsieur de Talleyrand repaired to the Senate, where several measures were formed into a decree. The persons whom Monsieur de Talleyrand had associated to his views took possession of the respective branches of the administration, which they were called upon in so illegal a manner to occupy without encountering any opposition, because everyone feels a degree of satisfaction in placing his responsibility under cover where there exists a necessity for receiving at every moment a fresh impulse. These places having been filled up, the administration became organized and proceeded at once to work. It openly avowed, or at least did not disguise its intentions, but it had yet not hoisted up any signal, nor assumed any other colors than the national ones. Monsieur de Chabrol, the prefect of the Seine, and Monsieur Pasquier, the prefect of police, were retained in their places, because they were found useful in both the hypothesis upon which Monsieur de Talleyrand had built his scheme. Those 2 magistrates were not men of the Revolution. They could only follow the impulse of events. For that purpose only had they been left in Paris. Monsieur de Talleyrand assembled at his residence the members of the provisional government and presented, or to speak more correctly, surrendered them to the Emperor of Russia, who only conversed with them in the language of one ready to protect the mighty labors they were about to undertake. He was sufficiently acquainted with mankind to know that this was the surest way of inducing them to fall in with his views. I have been told by the Archbishop of Mechlin himself that when this presentation took place, he solicited a private conversation with the Emperor Alexander, who granted his request, and he then told him that whatever plans might be in contemplation, public opinion would never declare itself so long as there existed no certain knowledge of his private sentiments, that at any rate the presence of Mr. de Caulaincourt in Paris kept everyone in check. The power of the Emperor Alexander was established upon foundations sufficiently solid to secure the success of what he was about to undertake. He gave an audience to Monsieur de Caulaincourt the same evening. The latter has never communicated to me the details of the interview, but he was assuredly not received in the character of French ambassador, though the Emperor of Russia showed him the same kindness as heretofore. The Duke of Vicenza was but too well aware of what was about to happen. He was the only one who had held a sufficiently direct intercourse with that prince not to be afraid of assuming, without transgressing the tone of language best adapted to existing circumstances. It is to be presumed that he did all in his power to avert the storm, or at least to retard its explosion. All his efforts, however, were unavailing. Alexander dryly signified to him that his presence operated as a restraint upon public opinion and prevented it from breaking out, whilst it was necessary for the sovereigns to be made acquainted with it in order that they might come to a decision. He accordingly directed him to withdraw from Paris, as allies had no answer to give to the communications of which he was the bearer. This injunction, and above all, the declaration pasted upon the walls of the capital, had greatly promoted the prospects of the conspirators, the senators being taken by surprise at the suddenness of the storm and kept in check by an intrigue, which will be presently related, could oppose no resistance. The forfeiture of the throne was made the subject of deliberation. Each individual was more or less implicated. No one attempted to combat the measure, and the emperor's downfall was decreed. Monsieur de Caulaincourt took his departure and returned to Fontainebleau, where the emperor had collected his feeble army, which did not amount to 60,000 men. The state of his mind on learning the reply of Alexander may easily be conceived. he had with him Marshals Berthier, Montcy, Lefebvre, Ney, MacDonald, Oudinot, Mortier, and Marmont, whose headquarters were at Essonne, midway on the road from Fontainebleau to Paris. Those of Marshal Mortier was near Villeroy, a little in the rear of Essonne towards Fontainebleau, so that the corps of the first named marshal formed the head of the column. Previously to quitting Paris, Marmont had transmitted to the emperor the capitulation, to which he had affixed his signature, and had informed him that if he attempted to force his way back to the capital, he might expect to find it all in arms against him. The aide-de-camp delivered the message such as he had received from the Duke of Ragusa, but he was not proof against the effect of his being made to tell so shameful a falsehood. It brought on an illness which kept him for a long time confined, and he acknowledged to a person who repeated his words to me that this guilty act of weakness had poisoned his peace of mind. Marmont himself repaired to the presence of the emperor at Fontainebleau, but was silent as to what had passed at his own house on the night of the capitulation. He withdrew and had already returned to Essonne when M. de Caulaincourt passed through that town. On his return from the audience from the Emperor of Russia, the emperor had kept the marshals about his person in ignorance of the dangers which impended over the state, but they had their families in Paris and were soon informed of all that had been done and of all that was farther meditated. A resolution was in course of adoption, the watchword of which was not yet uttered. The walls were lined with proclamations of Louis XVIII. The idea of the return of this prince was allowed freely to circulate. I cannot take upon myself to say whether it was by directions from or with the consent of the Emperor of Russia, who wished to sound the public opinion without appearing to influence it. In order to recede from that point of it, became necessary to substitute another idea which he foresaw the possibility necessitating of his adopting, or whether M. de Talleyrand had caused the proclamation to be placarded on the walls in consequence of secret instructions from the prince or of communications with him. It is quite clear, however, that they were both fully aware of what was going forward. A single word from them would have put an end to this state of confusion. Notwithstanding the anonymous character which it was pretended to give to the king's proclamations, there was no mistaking the source from whence they emanated, whether they were circulated by direction of the Emperor Alexander or of Mr. de Talleyrand. They both had motives for keeping aloof. I must explain my meaning. The Emperor Alexander had never ceased to repeat that he only waged war against the Emperor, that he had nothing to say against France, nor against the French people. He held this language for the purpose of detaching the nation from their chief, of rendering the latter unpopular, and of turning a settled object, the impulse which it was intended to give to the multitude. If he had openly avowed the plan which he carried into effect, no one would have ever been the dupe of his speeches, and he could not in such a case have committed a greater mistake than to allow of the placarding of the proclamations of Louis XVIII in the several towns of which he took possession. Had he done so, he would have found the country people hastening in crowds to enlist under banners of an insurrection, which would have acquired an easy organization. His fallacious promises of happiness had the effect of anticipating the movement and eventually secured the victory to him. It not only became necessary for Alexander to deceive the nation, he had also to impose upon the Emperor of Austria and to keep in reserve the means of pleading in his own justification the power of public opinion and of ascribing to its dictates what was exclusively his own work. It was not, therefore, until after the rupture of the conferences at Châtillon and until within sight of Paris that the proclamations were spread amongst the French advance posts. The Emperor of Austria had unquestionably many private grounds of complaint against the Emperor Napoleon, but one can never do him the injustice to suppose that he could have been insensible to the humiliating part he was made to act by being fastened to the car of the conqueror, who assigned to him no other share in the triumph than the disgrace of dethroning his daughter. It cannot be laid to the charge of this prince that he would have beheld with utter indifference every act having a tendency to that object if the Emperor of Russia had allowed him to see through his design. There exists not a father, whatever may be his situation in life, who does not endeavor to persuade himself that a deception had been practiced upon the Austrian monarch, who had presented his daughter to the affection of the French. graced with her own virtues and rich in the tender affection of her parent. It must also be taken for granted that had this monarch suspected nothing short of the intention of the Emperor of Russia in crossing the Rhine to dethroning his daughter, he would not only have answered her letters in a very different tone from that which he adopted in the correspondence he kept up with her ever since the invasion of our territory, but instead of confining himself to the recommendation that she should prevail upon her husband to make peace, he would have frankly told her of the dangers to which she was personally exposed. It must farther be added that he would not have kept himself at so great a distance from the headquarters of the Allied army, which he only came up with at Paris. He was made to see matters in the light in which the Emperor of Russia thought proper to exhibit them. These were the considerations that prevented the Emperor of Russia from avowing the plan of a revolution which would thenceforth have been looked upon as his own work. Monsieur de Talleyrand had still more powerful motives for acting with circumspection. In the first place, he was not in reality over anxious for the return of the elder branch of the House of Bourbon, with which he had too many accounts to settle and little leisure to treat of his own private interests. He clearly foresaw that the will of the Emperor of Russia would rule paramount. Nevertheless, he did not despair of persuading them in an unguarded moment to adopt a determination which, so long as it should not be publicly announced, might be liable to undergo a change. On the other hand, he knew how hopeless it was for him to accomplish the object he had in view, whilst the army should remain true to the emperor, because the majority of the nation would always rally round its standards. He steered clear of all these difficulties by inspiring with hopes the party who were desirous of the plain and simple return of the House of Bourbon, and calming the uneasiness of those who feared the consequences of such an event. He availed himself of both to bring his plans into effect. He had dispatched Monsieur de Montessuie to Marshal Marmont at his son, and sent at the same time General Lamotte to the Duke of Reggio, under whom he had served in the capacity of his aide-de-camp. These two messengers had each a different language to hold, in order that their missions might be attended with a uniform result. Their means of persuasion were the assurance that the Emperor of Russia was resolved not to treat with the Emperor, against whom alone all his efforts were directed, and that, with this single exception, he would grant whatever might be proposed to him. This was the language agreed upon in respect to Marshal Oudinot, because it was intelligible to him, and of a nature to be circulated amongst the troops, to which it might suggest the idea of a cowardly desertion, which the marshal himself encouraged, under the impression that nothing more was to be required than to sacrifice the emperor. Great care was taken not to present the question to him under another aspect, for his previous political conduct was not calculated to encourage the notion that he could ever come to terms with the Bourbons. He saw a bright prospect before him, lent a willing ear to every proposal, and agreed to whatever was required of him, without even reflecting on the consequences which such an acquiescence was about to produce. Montessuie adopted a different course in regard to Marmont. He announced to the marshal that Alexander's determination was taken, that this prince had declared his determination no longer to treat with the emperor, nor with any member of his family. He described in vivid colors the misfortunes about to fall upon France, its intestine divisions, a civil war with its attendant horrors, for it had been a settled point that the idea of a regency should be relinquished, as it would necessarily occasion the return of the emperor to power. He laid the greater stress upon this point, as it was the only means of compelling Marmont to come to a decision, and of giving definite object to his defection. Had the regency in fact been proclaimed, his own position would have been secure, whereas everything became compromised when he brought into contact with the revolutionary anarchy. He accordingly could not hesitate on the adoption of whatever might be proposed to him, were it even the return of the Bourbons, because on the one hand he had his own honors to preserve, and his vanity made him indulge the hope of acquiring fresh favors by setting the example of abandoning the emperor. These were the only considerations calculated to draw Marmont from his duty, and unless a part of the army could be induced to desert its colors, it would be altogether impossible to give effect to the wishes of the Emperor of Russia. Montessuie added that a state of anarchy would necessarily spring up if some determination were not quickly come to in order to bring everything back under some controlling authority. The essential object was to have a rallying point. This, he said, was so much in unison with M. de Talleyrand's sentiments that the latter had just written to Count d'Artois, as he preferred the Bourbons, who had been proclaimed at Bordeaux, to the Jacobins, who were beginning to raise their heads in all directions, et he Marmont, whose social qualities were calculated to win all hearts, his patriotic sentiments of so exalted a nature, and his military talents so well known, would consent to cover himself with glory by setting to the army the bold example of joining that party. He would avoid a civil war, a service more honorable than the possession of the most splendid crown. He added that independently of the personal satisfaction he would derive from such an act, his example would give him in the first claim to favor. The rather so, as the king's commissioners were taking note in Paris of all those who presented themselves and were receiving their oaths of allegiance and fidelity. This was false. One more traitor was sought for. Marmont saw through the snare and scornfully rejected the part reserved for him. The spirit of intrigue was not discouraged in this failure. It sent forth fresh emissaries, and a crowd of persons received flocking to his son, who, though loaded with the emperor's favors, were not the less ardent in their endeavors to detach the marshal from his service. The duke still resisted, but he had consented to listen to persons whom he ought not to have admitted to his presence. He soon paid the forfeit of this act of temerity. The leaders of the party which had espoused the enemy's cause were so far compromised that no other alternative was left for them but success or banishment. They were sensible of this and neglected no means of accomplishing the defection which they were so desirous to bring about. They set to work those magistrates who were likely to exercise any influence over the marshal. They dispatched some of his own friends to him, and whilst they represented the emperor's causes irretrievably lost, they urged Schwarzenberg to make such an offer as might, in some respects, be a plank of safety to him, by means of which he might hope to escape from the wreck. The generalissimo consented. His overtures were well received, and the basis of defection agreed upon. The Duke of Ragusa was, however, fully aware that if it were possible for him to deceive his troops, this was not the case. With regard to the general officers, he knew that the failure or success of his view wholly depended upon them. He accordingly determined to communicate to them the proposals which were made to him under the pretense of their being personally interested in the matter, and of his unwillingness to decide upon the principal act of their lives. Without their approbation, he summoned them to a kind of council, which was attended amongst the rest by Generals Compin, Souhem, and Bourseau. The latter was unquestionably one of the bravest men in existence. He must have been strangely imposed upon when he could consent to go over to a hostile army, for he was much more likely to have fought it single-handed. Marmont, who exercised a certain power over the opinions of others, an ascendancy, moreover, necessarily emanating from his military command, the weight of which was fully felt by those under him, communicated to his generals that he had just taken place between M. de Montessuie and himself. He gave them a long and painful detail of all the evils to which his country was about to fall prey if someone did not set the example of rallying around a power which might hereafter acquire solidity and preserve France from a state of anarchy. He told them that this power was the House of Bourbon, which the Allies were recalling to the throne, and with which Paris was already in open communication that neither France nor Frenchmen would lose by the change, as the Emperor alone would be sacrificed. As for himself, he announced to them that his mind was already made up. He had called them together to make them acquainted with his resolution and left them at liberty to form their own determination. He was well aware that a mind of a superior stamp never fails to draw weaker characters after it, especially under circumstances the nature of which was beyond the reach of ordinary understandings. The generals of his army could not, besides, suspect the intentions of their chief from the moment that the emperor's personal fate was concerned. They imagined that he obeyed the laws of imperative necessity, and they adopted the same course of conduct, whilst they deeply lamented being reduced to desert the cause of their sovereign. The intercourse opened by Schwarzenberg was followed up The conditions of the act of defection were discussed and agreed upon, but not signed. Marmont accordingly retained the position which he then occupied. He continued to form the head of a column, either in consequence of any further hesitation on his part, or because he was desirous of recovering from the effects of the artifices employed to bring him over. Chapter 7. Affairs were not going on satisfactorily in Paris. The Emperor of Russia had so cautiously kept in reserve the means of altering his determination that, according to what was reported to me by Mr. Angla, the conspirators considered for a moment that all was over. Matters went so far that on retiring from a conference which had been held at the residence of the Emperor of Russia, Mr. Angla ordered his traveling carriage to be prepared for a journey, feeling persuaded that everything was settled. The engagement entered into by Marmont restored tranquility to all guilty consciences. There were to be found in Paris some individuals of sound sense who, though not altogether pleased with the imperial government, felt themselves degraded by being objects of speculation and traffic for certain intriguers long accustomed to serve and betray every party. It was easy to perceive that a specific direction was given to the movement, which was kept up without any indication being afforded by the power which supported it. Bordeaux offered a recent example. When the mayor of that city had declared for the Duc d'Angoulême, his influence had been used for the purpose of causing the royal banners to be unfurled. The notables had met and proceeded in a body to demand of the general commanding the English troops which had taken possession of the town, whether it was by his orders that signs were displayed which had a tendency to kindle a civil war, and the latter had replied that he gave no special countenance to any party and left everyone at liberty to act as he thought proper. In Paris, the municipal body were excited to take part in the change of government. Some of the very members, such as Monsieur Pillard, the lawyer, and Monsieur Perignon, formerly a notary, had boldly thrust themselves forward. These circumstances had created a deep impression upon those who dreaded fresh turmoils or were unwilling to serve as stepping stones to a handful of intriguers. It occurred to several men of sound judgment to write anonymously to the Emperor Alexander, but in a style calculated to carry conviction to his mind. They were not sparing of representations to him respecting the degree of esteem or confidence which those men were entitled to who were busily at work under the protection of his name. It is likewise very possible that the Emperor Alexander sought to acquire by other means a correct knowledge of the state of public opinion. Whether he was shaken by the mass of interests he would have to struggle against, or by some other consideration, certain it is that he was on the point of discarding the political breaknecks who so closely adhered to his steps in this state of indecision. How powerful would have been the influence created by the presence of the Empress in Paris? Perceiving the Emperor Alexander's hesitation, Mr. de Talleyrand became apprehensive of his escaping from his grasp. He foresaw the impossibility of inducing anyone to join in the measures requisite for preventing the future return of the Emperor Napoleon if Maria Louisa remained on the throne. As the danger was daily growing more urgent and alarming, he gave up the idea of a regency and adopted the cause of the Bourbons. The adoption of this cause was not unattended with personal inconveniences, but it excluded all idea of retracing his previous steps after the proceeding of so sudden and so extraordinary a nature. It could not fail to afford him the means of reverting to his first scheme by setting the revolutionary party in motion previously to allowing the Bourbons to acquire a firm footing. This was no difficult matter. Most of the places in the administration were held by men of that party. We now behold Talleyrand, determined to procure the adoption of what he had hitherto rejected by every means in his power. From that moment he only sought to remove the state of doubt shown by the Emperor Alexander, and did not hesitate, according to an old saying, in pinning him to the wall. It was certainly of the utmost importance that the Emperor should be induced to come to an immediate decision, as the diplomatist already found himself exposed to the reproaches of all those who had embarked with him in the undertaking. The provisional government was even on the point of dissolving itself. Mr. de Talleyrand possessed too much experience of men and of business to be wanting in coolness on this occasion. I am informed that he assembled the members of the provisional government at the close of the conference, which had been dispelled so many bright illusions. He drew a picture of the danger which they incurred and easily persuaded them to follow him to the Emperor of Russia, who occupied the first floor of his hotel. He addressed the emperor on the part of his colleagues and observed that the persons who accompanied him had exposed themselves to the loss of everything dear to them for the purpose of securing his triumph. They alone had kept the population of the capital within the limits of obedience and had readily compromised the existence of themselves and of their families in order to serve his cause, and they were about to be repaid for their zeal by being given up to those sentiments of revenge which they had so blindly provoked. In this lamentable state of things, they came in a body to request he would secure an asylum to them if he persisted in the intention which he had manifested. Alexander calmed their mistaken apprehensions of personal danger. He said that his ideas were certainly not yet fixed, but that he would never desert men who would risk everything for his service, and he would secure to them such means of existence as would meet their most sanguine expectations. Matters had proceeded thus far when M. de Talleyrand acquired the certainty that he might rely upon the defection of Marmont and upon the zeal of Oudinot. From that moment, he felt greater hopes of success and took particular care to communicate them to the Emperor of Russia, who assembled on the following morning the council, wherein the question of overturning the imperial government of France was definitely discussed. I received from one of the members of that council the details of what took place at its meeting. It was composed of the Emperor Alexander, the King of Prussia, Prince Schwarzenberg, Mr. de Metternich, and if I mistake not, the English ambassador, though I cannot be positive with respect to the latter. The French members called to this council were M. de Talleyrand, the Duc d'Alberg, M. Louis, General Dupont, General de Saulles, and the Archbishop of Mechlin. And if I recollect rightly, Messieurs Montesquieu, the Abbé of that name, Bournonville, and Jaucourt. The discussion was opened by the Emperor Alexander. He declared his intention of overthrowing the imperial government, but stated it to be his wish, previously to a public announcement of the circumstance, to ascertain what the order of things might be substituted for it, so as to avoid a return of those internal dissensions which had for so many years disturbed the repose of the country. He addressed himself to M. de Talleyrand, requesting him to state his opinion on the subject. The latter feeling averse to expressing before so many persons an opinion which might not perhaps be adopted and might eventually be the ground of his removal from the government about to be established, acted in this instance the part which I had seen him resort to when called upon to attend at any of the emperor's councils. He spoke with his usual flow of words, laid great stress upon the necessity of crushing the emperor, but enumerated at the same time the powerful interests which rested upon the imperial system and were inseparable from it. He stated the impossibility of substituting in its stead any other than an order of things affording to everyone a guarantee for the possession of what he had acquired, a departure from which course would be the signal for fresh anarchy. He cautiously abstained from giving a clearer expression of his sentiments, but his language sufficiently proved that he was still in favor of a regency. Mr. Louis gave utterance to opinions which were echoed by all the dependents of the diplomatist. It came at last to the turn of General de Saulles, when called upon to state his views as to what ought to be done. He replied with great animation the following words, which he addressed to the Emperor Alexander: "Sire, the regency is a mere name. The tiger lies crouching behind it, and it will soon spring up again if that regency be proclaimed. At any rate, my mind is made up. I ask nothing for myself, but, sire, what is to become of Mademoiselle de Dampierre? Save her! I can beseech you, save her!" Astounded at the warmth of this appeal, the Emperor of Russia was inquiring who was Mademoiselle Dampierre. "Sire, she's my wife. She is Madame de Saulles. She is certainly not connected in any direct manner with the question now under debate. Nevertheless, she is Mademoiselle de Dampierre, save what is dearest to me in life." This trivial alarm of a conjugal nature had the effect of unruffling for a moment the gravity of the council, but its calm was soon restored, and the discussion continued. The turn of the Archbishop of Mechlin came next. He boldly discovered his game. "Gentlemen," said he, it becomes us to speak in plain language. You are determined to lay the emperor's side altogether. In that case, why not restore to France a government under which it has enjoyed whole centuries of uninterrupted happiness? I have no hesitation in asserting in this place that such is the secret wish of the great majority of Frenchmen, and if they are fearful of avowing it, it is to be ascribed to the circumstance that the national spirit is kept in check and afraid of manifesting itself without the certainty of being supported. For my part, I must declare that after we have overthrown the emperor, the only rational plan is to recall the Bourbons. Alexander put a stop to the discussion, and turning to Frederick William, King of Prussia, said he, "What is your opinion?" "I coincide with the Archbishop of Mechlin," replied Frederick William. The Emperor of Russia continued to take votes of the other foreigners, who all agreed with the King of Prussia. Alexander, in his turn, delivered his own opinion and said that it was a question of very high importance to determine upon the government which ought to be established in France without creating confusion and without risking the repose of its neighbors. He thought the House of Bourbon was best calculated for the nation. Nevertheless, he should postpone his decision until the following day. He had been informed of the arrival of the advanced posts of a deputation from Fontainebleau. He would receive it and consider afterwards what ought to be done. The council broke up. I have already stated that everything that took place in Paris was fully known at Fontainebleau. Matters were even greatly exaggerated, although the evil was no doubt of a most serious nature. Nevertheless, the emperor did not allow himself to be influenced by the reports that were circulated about him, being wholly bent upon military combinations. He was preparing to make a fresh attempt when the Duke of Vicenza arrived. He was not the bearer of very pleasing intelligence, but the allies at least were no longer averse to a regency. The state of affairs was truly alarming. The order of the soldiery was at its height. Napoleon continued his arrangements for the purpose of trying the chance of war, but his generals had lost all enthusiasm. They were tired of wars and battles. All felt a kind of dread at the new risks about to be encountered. In the midst of this prevailing uneasiness, a decree of forfeiture reached Fontainebleau. Napoleon was no sooner informed of it than his hesitation ceased. The Civil War presented itself to his view in all its horrors. He withdrew and penned with his own hand the act which was to deprive him of power. Having signed his abdication, he appointed commissioners who, in transmitting it to the Allies, should discuss the interests of France and those of the gallant men who had faithfully adhered to him. He named the Duke of Vicenza and the Prince of Moskva to act in that capacity, but he had no sooner appointed them than he recollected his old aide-de-camp. He instantly associated Marmont to them and felt desirous that his oldest companion of arms should be the person to discuss the interests of his family. As, however, it was intimated to him that the interests of the army ought also to be advocated, that a man who had hitherto possessed a smaller share of his affections, Macdonald, for example, would carry more weight, he yielded assent and agreed to name the Duke of Tarentum. Nevertheless, he was still swayed by a feeling of partiality. The plenipotentiaries were specially directed to apprise the Duke of Ragusa that though he had not formerly chosen him, he could not refuse bestowing this last mark of confidence to his fidelity, which was guaranteed to him by favors commensurate with the marshal's services. If therefore the latter did not deem himself more usefully engaged at the head of his corps than in Paris, he was at liberty to join the plenipotentiaries, as they were instructed to dispatch a courier from Isson, who would return with the necessary powers. On arriving at Isson, the plenipotentiaries communicated to the Duke of Ragusa what had taken place at Fontainebleau, the abdication assented to by Napoleon, and the object of their mission to Paris. They also transmitted to him the message of which they were the bearers. This circumstance must have created a painful sensation upon the marshal, since he had, as we have related, just entered into conditions with the Austrian generalissimo. He did not disguise from his colleagues on what terms he stood with the allies. He declared to them that his mode of proceeding bore an isolated character merely from the circumstance of the dispersion of the army and the difficulty of coming to a right understanding, but from this moment he would irrevocably join and accompany them to Paris in order to explain to Prince Schwarzenberg the changes that had occurred in his position. He cautioned his generals, at least according to his own statement, not to make the slightest movement until he should send them fresh orders, and he repaired to the enemy's headquarters, where the plan of the convention was annulled without the slightest opposition. The three marshals and the Duke of Vicenza continued their journey and repaired to Paris for the purpose of negotiating in common. They alighted at the hotel of Monsieur de Talleyrand, where, as I have already stated, the Emperor of Russia had taken up his residence, and they communicated to the diplomatist that the motive of their journey, what it was, and what was the mission. One of the plenipotentiaries drew him aside and said that if he could obtain a regency, they, without naming anyone, were determined to take part against the emperor so as to prevent his return to power. He did not state what he meant by taking part against the emperor. Monsieur de Talleyrand replied that everything should be arranged. The allied sovereigns demanded no more than such a guarantee and would grant whatever was applied for, as soon as they should acquire the conviction that Napoleon would never again appear. Monsieur de Talleyrand could desire nothing better than this confidential communication. It greatly heightened his credit and clearly proved that nothing could be done without him. He went to the apartments of the Emperor Alexander, apprised him of the arrival of the marshals, and related what had just taken place without omitting the overture made to him. Nothing undoubtedly could be more satisfactory to them, for what could be more clear than the constant demand made by the Emperor Alexander of a guarantee against the return of the Emperor Napoleon? The name itself was not openly avowed, but the affectation with which guarantees were called for left no room to doubt what was the object actually contemplated. He judged a Frenchman by the standard of some other nations. He was so far wrong. This mode of proceeding is ill-suited to our manners. I heard from one of Monsieur de Talleyrand's secretary that when everything was concluded, that is to say, when the forfeiture was pronounced, Monsieur de Rhoda could not understand our scruples. What a country, he said. What a nation. That a mere trifle should keep you back. This would not be the case with us. All would be over in a quarter of an hour. So much the worse for the sovereign who sets himself up in opposition to the interests of all. Nothing in the world is so easily found as a sovereign. The Emperor of Russia caused it to be intimated to the deputation of marshals that he would receive them at 9 or 10 o'clock the next morning. They withdrew in order to meet during the night at Marshal Ney's hotel and were visited there and fed with the idea that the emperor alone was an obstacle to a satisfactory adjustment of everything. Were it not for him, the sovereigns would grant a regency or any other government they might think proper to select. These insinuations were unavailing, since the emperor himself had enjoined his plenipotentiaries to consider him as wholly out of the question and to submit to any sacrifices that might be personal to himself. I have been furnished by an individual who was present at this meeting with all the details of what was said and done on the occasion, and they clearly proved to what an extent the blind confidence entertained in the sentiments of the Emperor of Russia had been carried. That confidence, however, has been the source of too many and too bitter tears to warrant our now making it a reproach to those who participated in it. It was still imagined that Monsieur de Talleyrand was favorably disposed towards the regency, and I think his opinion was well-founded, though it must be admitted that the diplomatist was as ready to adopt any other hypothetical case. Caulaincourt has since informed me that this was a mistake, that Monsieur de Talleyrand had from the very commencement openly declared himself in favor of the House of Bourbon. I am persuaded, on the contrary, that such was not the fact. When, however, the business was at once settled, it was better to assume the merit of having brought it about than to admit that he was opposed to the change. It is also possible that Monsieur de Talleyrand had allowed his intercourse with Hartwell to become known in order to increase the confusion, to reserve for himself greater chances of success, and have it in his power to obtain better conditions. It is improbable that the allies availed themselves of this circumstance in order to wrest from the Duke of Vicenza those sacrifices they were desirous of imposing upon him, for as we are informed by one of the auxiliaries they had brought over to their side, they did not anticipate such immediate success in the pursuit of their views, and were desirous of completing by means of intrigue what was already begun by force of arms. In this case, however, convinced as he was that Monsieur de Talleyrand was in favor of the Bourbons, why did not Monsieur de Caulaincourt put the marshals on their guard? Why did he take them to the house of a conspirator, whom he should have avoided by every means in his power? The least inconvenience that could befall them from the course into which he was leading them was that of bringing them to confess to the fox, as it actually came to pass. It is probable, nevertheless, whatever he may have subsequently asserted to the contrary, that he was himself the dupe of the false character character assumed by Monsieur de Talleyrand. Otherwise, the inference to be drawn from his conduct would be that he had it in contemplation to deliver up the marshals. This supposition would add great weight to the unfavorable suspicions entertained in respect to his own stay at Châtillon. They might have met at other places and have then repaired to the presence of the Emperor Alexander rather than be compelled to call upon Mr. de Talleyrand if he was actually considered by them as an enemy. It is painful to me to make known the real facts, but the truth is that finding the Emperor's downfall to be unavoidable, they only wish to withdraw from his service without dishonor and to prepare the means of securing a position with the government about to succeed that of Napoleon, being under the impression that it was possible to retain what had been acquired under the cloak of an act of cowardice. Chapter 8. The Emperor of Russia received a deputation of marshals agreeably to his promise, and after listening to their message, he informed them that he could not treat any longer with the Emperor Napoleon. He added that independently of the objections which he, as well as his allies, felt for any kind of accommodation, the repose of Europe, which depended on that of France, did not admit of his paying attention to the proposals entrusted to them. He felt no wish to injure our frontiers or to destroy or make any inroad upon the fabric raised by the French army, for which he entertained the highest esteem. He was disposed to give them every proof of it by the choice he should make of the form of government, which it was his intention to propose for their acceptance. He observed that whatever might be that government, he should always have particularly at heart to keep up a friendly understanding with men who would raise their country to so high a pitch of glory. He spoke in a firm tone and appeared the more resolute in his intentions, as he was acquainted with the overture made to Mr. de Talleyrand. He was besides fully aware that the determination adopted was of a positive nature, that it had been taken at the residence of the Prince of Neuchâtel in consequence of the communications held between Marshal Oudinot and Mr. de Talleyrand's envoy. The plan, which was formed previously to the Battle of Champ-au-Père, had even been again brought forward at this meeting. It was nothing less than that they should deal with the Emperor Napoleon in the same manner as Romulus had been dealt with, and formerly treat with the enemy. As soon as the Emperor had ceased to speak, the Duke of Tarentum gave utterances to his sentiments. He had been less favored by the Emperor than any other marshal, and he showed himself the most deserving of the rewards which had been heaped upon others. He laid great stress upon the merit of the Emperor's sacrifice, insisted upon the rights of his dynasty, and the propriety of adopting a regency. Reverting then to the subject which most engaged the attention of the Allies, the person of Napoleon, he remarked that if he was the only ground of difficulty in the way, everything was at once decided, since the powers with which they were invested prescribed to them that they should leave him out of the question. The continuation of his dynasty was therefore as free from objection as it was from any danger. The transfer of the supreme power ought the less to become a subject matter for discussion, as the intentions just manifested by Alexander in his own name and in the name of his allies were perfectly conformable to the constitutions of the state and favorable to the right of him who, in the order of nature, was pointed out by those very constitutions as the legitimate heir to the throne. Macdonald proved himself no less cogent in his reasonings in this discussion than honorable by the courage which he displayed in defending the interests of the regency, as being fully calculated to guarantee to everyone the preservation of what they had acquired, an object which the Emperor Alexander expressed in his determination to secure. This prince was at a loss for an answer, and no longer insisted on anything more than the necessity of a guarantee against the possibility of the Emperor's return to power. It did not become the marshals to name the guarantee required. It was incumbent on the allies themselves to specify what were the sacrifices which they were desirous of imposing, and to explain what they meant by the expression of guarantee. The plenipotentiaries pretended not to understand it. The allies, on the other hand, did not deem it advisable to speak in clearer language.